Prague off the beaten track. Vít Pohanka takes you away from the crowds to the city's hidden gems.
Radio Prague International is starting Prague Off the Beaten Track, a new podcast exploring the hidden gems of Prague, uncovering unique places, stories and cultural experiences away from the usual tourist paths and the crowds. I'm Danny Bate, and I'm joined here by the host of Prague Off the Beaten Track and also my colleague, Vít Pohanka. Vít, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I think the first question that comes to mind is, why this podcast and why now here at the beginning of 2025?
Well, as listeners of Radio Prague International and the readers of our web pages will probably know, we try to introduce also other regions in Czechia. I like to report about Moravia, which is the eastern part of the country, and other beautiful places. But the fact remains that when we do stories about Prague, they are usually visited on the web pages or listened to by most people. I mean, that's a fact, that we, for me, someone from the regions, unfortunately, we have to live with. And we were just thinking how to do it, how to report about Prague in some kind of new, slightly creative way, so that we don't, introduce again and again, the kind of famous places like Prague Castle, etc., etc. And I just got this idea, and I searched in Google for Prague Off the Beaten Track, for this term. And to my surprise, of course, there are some web pages that you will find like this that kind of refer to places that are off the beaten track in Prague. But mostly, frankly speaking, they are referring to quite well-known places. And I thought, there are so many beautiful places, interesting places that are really off the beaten track and that are worth visiting. So I came with this proposal. And because Radio Prague International is a part of the Czech National Public Radio, it's an institution, so everything takes a little bit of time. And now we are coming up with this Prague Off the Beaten Track after a few months, after, we prepared everything, the graphics, what it looks like, the logo, etc. So that's the reason why we decided to do that. In other words, just to sum it up, to show Prague, hopefully in a new and not so well-known way, or from an angle that is not so well-known.
Not only as your colleague, but also as a Prague resident myself, I completely endorse this idea. There are so many nooks and crannies in this city that people just generally don't know about. And I've had the pleasure to get to know, over several years, a podcast that introduces them to new visitors to the city. Fantastic, all fine by me. Now, some of the listeners will know from Czechcast, which is the other podcast that you host for Radio Prague International, that you don't now live in Prague. You live outside Prague in the Vysočina region of the country, which is sort of in the middle of the Czech Republic. So let me ask you quite bluntly, why should you be presenting this podcast when you don't even live in Prague?
That's true that I don't live here. I wasn't born here. I wasn't raised here. I openly say I like to think of myself as a kind of village boy, but one that traveled actually quite far. And and this is no exaggeration, I recently counted all the addresses where I say I lived, where I stayed for a prolonged period of time, where I had telephone, for example, where I received mail or post in British English. And I found out that I lived at 27 different addresses in 10 cities, in 6 countries, on 2 continents. And 7 of those addresses were actually in Prague. Because I came here in the 1990s, I at that time got a job at the Czech television, and I have to say, I was very poor. I was already living with my then partner, today my wife, and we had to move around a lot because we didn't have much money. So we were staying in these various different places. So you would be right. If you called me in Czech naplavenina, which probably would be best translated as transplant or blow-in. But there are many such people in Prague. And I think just the fact itself that I was moving around Prague so often, and I always kept coming back actually to Prague, that it gave me the chance to get to know with different parts of Prague. And I will be cheeky enough to say that I've got some friends who were actually born in Prague and raised here. And quite often I find out that they don't know Prague as well, because usually they stayed with their parents, then they got a flat or something, and then, they just lived there. And they didn't have this unique naplavenina experience of having to move in various different parts of Prague.
Makes sense. Yes, if you come from the outside, then you want to get to know where you're living. It makes total sense to me. So which parts of Prague did you live in while you were in this city?
I actually wrote it down today, just to make sure that I don't forget about anything. First, we moved to Barrandov. Now, some people may know Barrandov as this part of Prague where there are famous film studios. One of the private televisions has got a headquarters there. But we actually stayed in the Paneláky, the housing estate. I think it was one of the last that was built before 1989. So we actually ended up there. It was an accident because a friend of mine got some money. He bought a flat and he needed someone to stay there for about a year. So he wasn't asking for too much money, just very basic kind of rent. So that's where we started. Then we moved to Řepy, which is Prague 6. Again, this was Panelák. Then we had to move to Libeň. That's the old kind of working class part of Prague, now gentrified, I have to say. Then we stayed in Petřiny. I don't know if you've heard of it. I mean, there are quite famous, I would say, student hostels, where a lot of people stayed who came to Prague. Then we were lucky enough to get an apartment or a flat in Vinohrady, not far from the Czech radio. And then I actually was offered a job in Paris. So we moved to Paris, where I worked for nearly 3 years for UNESCO. Then when I returned, I stayed in Davice for, I think, half a year, something like that. Then I had to move to... Davice is, by the way, the very nice kind of part of Prague. Many diplomats live there, high, I would say, civil servants, etc. Very nice place in Prague 6. Then I had to move to Stodulky. And again, someone who knows Prague a little bit will know that Stodulky is this huge housing estate again. But I was lucky enough to get a place in the old Stodulky, in the original village. That's apart from the Paneláky. So I stayed there in Stodulky, then I stayed in Zahradní Město, and finally, in between, I was out of Prague for more than a year, actually, when I worked for BBC World Service. So I was in London, but I would always come back and then, get a new place. That time in Zahradní Město. And then my wife and I already had a son, so we managed to buy a small flat in Zelenec, which is on the outskirts. It's just outside of Horní Počernice, which I believe is Prague 9. And it's one of those kind of sleeping communities, where people just who work in Prague just go to sleep. But it's a very nice place, and that's how we stopped moving around Prague. And now, after many years again abroad, working as a correspondent for Czech radio, we settled in the Vysočina region in the highlands, because that's where we wanted to stay with my wife, who is also from the same town of Žďár nad Sázavou, like I am. But I still keep coming to Prague, I have to say, quite often, and I feel really home here. I mean, it's kind of difficult to explain. I really... even though my real home is in the country, I mean, when I come to Prague, I feel very kind of comfortable and very curious about the city.
Makes sense. It sounds like you're the ideal person then to be recording this podcast, especially because I've been tracking in my head these places you've been listing. That is an impressive distribution over the city centre. I think all the points of the compass were covered there. So yes, you are definitely the right man for the job. How often these days would you say you come to Prague though? And when you are in Prague, let's say you just turn up with a free day, what are some places that you would instinctively head to as your favourites?
There are weeks when I have to come to Prague more than twice, sometimes 3 times a week. Luckily enough for me, I mean, the train ride is, is not very long. It's about 2 hours by train, actually. And I actually have to admit that I don't really have one particular or several particular favorite places. What I really appreciate about Prague is that you can walk around a lot, especially if you lived in the United States for some time, as I did. Then you really appreciate that you can walk around the city. So these days with map apps, on your cell phone, I usually try to plan a trip or a walk or a trail that I haven't been to. So recently I kind of discovered again, this part on the embankment of Prague between Karlín and Troja, where you can walk. There's a nice bike path, actually, but for pedestrians as well. Or in Prague 4, for example, there's a very nice area which I will want to introduce, I think, quite soon. So, in other words, I don't have favorite places. So I try to discover those places in Prague where not so many people go to.
Very good. And so I know that as a podcast, this is an open-ended project that you're working on, but in the first few episodes, at least, of Prague Off the Beaten Track, where can listeners expect that you will be taking their ears to?
I will be taking them to Štvanice Island, or the Chase Island, I think would be, because would be the English translation. This is an island in the Vltava or the Moldau River between Karlín and Holešovice, very close to the center, and you can actually walk there. You can take a tram if you want to, and very interesting history there. And there is a group of people who are actually surfing on the Vltava. There's an artificial wave, so I want to talk about them as well. Then I will stay probably in the next episode around Vltava in Podskalí. It's this part of Prague. I think it's officially or formally Prague 2. It's quite close to the center again. It's under the Vyšehrad rock. That's why it's Podskalí in Czech, Podskálu, under the rock. I will do an episode on Nový Svět as well. Now that's a kind of, I would say, on the verge whether it's really off the beaten track or whether it's central, because it's in the Hradčany. But I think I decided to do that because I think it's a beautiful example of this thing that if you are in a touristy, very popular place, which the Hradčany is, sometimes if you take just a little step aside to the side streets, you can find out that all of a sudden you are far from the maddening crowd, I would say, even. And then I've got an episode planned as well about Prokopské údolí. I like to think about it as it's the Prokop Valley, to translate it. It's a little bit further away from the center, but it's a really a piece of nature within the city, I would say. It's something like, I don't know, maybe Hampstead Heath in London, even though it's not so completely surrounded by houses and buildings. Or perhaps if someone from Washington, D.C. listens, it's like a Rock Creek Park, I think, in Washington, D.C., which also is not kind of artificially kind of manicured park. It's a piece of nature in the city. So these are the first 4 episodes. I'm very careful. I was actually listening to my introduction to Czechcast, the sister podcast or the brother podcast that I mentioned. And when I was recording it, I think I said that I never wanted to do interviews that I would have to translate. And then I realized that I have these interviews with Madeleine Albright. So I thought, well, I could use them in Czechcast because, that's an interesting piece of history that I recorded, the former US Secretary of State who recently passed away. And then I realized that the reason why I was speaking to her was because she spoke Czech. So I had to translate the interviews into English. So I kind of didn't keep the rule that I made. So the reason why I mentioned that, I don't want to set too many rules for Prague Off the Beaten Track, or I like to call it POBT. The abbreviation. I just hope it's going to be shorter versions of Czechcast, which is usually longer. This should be 10 to 15 minutes, and it should be about interesting places in Prague.
Sounds great. I'll be listening. I know for a fact that I'll be listening, and I'm sure this will find a great audience. Well, on behalf of Radio Prague International, I'd just say we're all so looking forward to the first few episodes. Vít, thank you so much for coming in today and telling us all about it.
Thank you for your kind words, and thank you for hosting this first pilot episode of Prague Off the Beaten Track.
Prague Off the Beaten Track Vít Pohanka takes you away from the crowds to the city's hidden gems.